Hey, A&P class. Before we jump into chapter 13, the endocrine system, I wanted to give a couple of announcements. First of all, I think most of you have probably seen your grades from the test from exam 3. Those are posted in D2L in case you haven't already. Always, like usual, double check that what's in Connect matches what's posted in D2L as far as like your actual grade on the exam. And then also, I believe now that you can go in and see which ones you got right and which ones you got wrong, and look at those individually. I'm really limited in what I can see as far as the student view of Connect. So on my end, it looks like you can go in and get the feedback now. If that's not the case, let me know, and I'll try to get that open for you. But you hopefully can go in and see which ones you missed. Also, another announcement is make sure you're watching the lecture videos on the correct day that the lecture would have normally been held. I don't care what time of day you look at those and watch those, but make sure you're doing those on the correct day. And make sure that you're going through on D2L looking at the checklists for each day, making sure that you are caught up on the correct videos that you're to be watching, the Connect homework, and if there's any other assignments or labs or anything that we'll be doing. Okay, so that'll be a good helpful tool. Also, make sure you watch the videos from beginning to end, because there may be places throughout the video where I say, hey, you need to watch this video here to supplement what we're talking about in lecture. I may give some case studies throughout as we get a little bit further down the road. So make sure you're watching the full videos. Okay. And so if you have any questions or concerns or anything, please reach out to me through email, or you can try my office phone. We'll see. Sometimes calls aren't coming through, but if you want to speak with me, send me an email with your phone number and I can call you, and that seems to work a little bit better. Okay, so chapter 13, we're going to go back in our book, back to chapter 13. I don't like to start out with this chapter. This one should have, if you were following the book, should have been the first chapter that we jumped into. I think it's a little bit abstract and I think it's a little bit difficult. So I don't like to just give you this chapter right off the bat, first day of class. I like to kind of get you a little bit through the semester first before we talk about the endocrine system and hormones and all that kind of thing. So we're going to spend 2 days on the endocrine system. We're going to start out today and do the first half of the chapter and finish up the second half on Wednesday. Okay, so jumping into the endocrine system, we're going to start out with a little bit of background information. In our bodies, we have what are called endocrine and exocrine glands, and these are something that you'll need to know the difference between. Okay, you'll need to know what an endocrine gland consists of and what an exocrine gland consists of and how they are different, because they are very different. So endocrine glands, we'll cover some of those. An example of an endocrine gland would be the thyroid, or the hypothalamus. Okay, those are a couple examples. Endocrine glands make up the endocrine system along with cells and other organs or tissues. Okay, these cells, organs, and tissues are going to secrete chemicals called hormones. They're kind of like chemical messengers called hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, they do not have ducts or tubes that transport the hormones. Okay, the hormones enter in the blood and then circulate all throughout the body. Okay, and those hormones are then going to act on what we call target cells. Okay, these are the cells that respond to the hormone. So if you look at the word endo, okay, if you take it back to the Latin, endo means inside of or internal. And then crine or crin means secretion. So they're going to secrete chemicals called hormones inside the body into the bloodstream. Okay. Now, exocrine glands, exo means out of or outer, outside. Okay, and these glands are going to have ducts or tubes that lead to a surface. Could be the surface of the skin, like with sweat glands. They're going to secrete the sweat. It's going to travel through the tube and be deposited on the surface of your skin. Or in the case of the, so these would be sweat glands. Gallbladder. Okay, the gallbladder is connected to the duodenum with a tube. Okay, it's going to secrete that into the duodenum or the small intestine. Oops, small intestine. Okay, so there's a tube that connects the gland to the point of delivery, and it's a very specific site, right? It's a very specific place in the small intestine, or a very specific point on the outside of the skin, okay, that their products, their secretions are sent to. Okay, mammary glands, milk glands are also examples of exocrine glands. So know the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands. Now, there are also some glands that secrete messenger molecules, but that are not true hormones. And these messenger molecules would be things like paracrine secretions, which would be an example of that would be prostaglandin. Okay, prostaglandin is going to affect nearby cells. It's not going to go through the bloodstream like a true hormone would, but it will influence the cells very close to the point of where it was released into the interstitial fluid. An autocrine secretion is, auto means self, basically self-secreting or self-stimulating secretions. Remember back in the immune system, we talked about the T and the B cells and how they had to be activated by helper T cells, okay? Those immune cytokines, immune messages are autocrine secretions, okay, that white blood cells release to stimulate each other, okay? Let's see. So here it just kind of illustrates the difference between endocrine and exocrine gland. Here's the thyroid. It's going to be an exocrine gland. I'm sorry, it's going to be an endocrine gland. Okay, so here's the cells of the thyroid inside here, and here's a blood vessel running in between some of those cells. Okay, this cell here is going to produce a hormone called T3, for example. That T3 is going to enter the bloodstream and then travel throughout the body and go wherever it needs to go, okay? So transported through the blood. Exocrine glands, here's a sweat gland way down here in the skin. It's going to secrete sweat, and the sweat is going to travel all through that little duct up into the skin surface, okay? So travels by a duct, secretes hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, another important thing to know for the next test is the difference between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So in A&P1, you guys learned about the nervous system, and you learned that the function of the nervous system, or a function of the nervous system, is communication. Well, here's a similarity between the endocrine system and the nervous system, and that is communication is a function of both. They're both designed to communicate and send messages and tell cells and tissues and organs on the other end to speed up, slow down, get to work, stop working, take a nap, do whatever. Okay. Another similarity is that both produce chemicals that bind to receptor molecules. Okay, so they send a chemical message, and that chemical message is going to be received by a special molecule at the other end. Okay, so in the nervous system, they're going to release a chemical called a neurotransmitter that's going to affect what we call a postsynaptic cell. Okay, that's the receptor molecules are going to be on that postsynaptic cell. Okay, in the endocrine system, hormones are going to travel through the bloodstream to a target cell, and the receptor molecule is going to be on the target cell that's going to detect that hormone. Okay, so here's a really good table for that comparison for getting ready for the next test. I know you just took one, but got to be thinking ahead all the time. So nervous system versus endocrine system, cells, neurons, glandular epithelial cells, neurotransmitter versus hormone, postsynaptic cell versus target cell, speed, very quickly. And these here depend on the hormone and or target cell. Okay, so could be really fast reaction, or it could take hours, could be very brief, or it could last for days, just depends. With the neurotransmitters, if that signal's not continually sent, that message is going to be very short-lived. But if it can be continuously sent, so that it can be prolonged. But when the message goes away, the response stops. Okay. So here's just a visual of, of what that would look like. Okay, so here we have on letter A is the nervous system. We have a neuron sending an impulse, involves the neurotransmitter, jumping across here and targeting a postsynaptic cell. With the endocrine system in letter B, here we have the glandular epithelial cells producing a hormone. We'll call this hormone X. Hormone X enters the bloodstream. It travels all throughout the body through the bloodstream. And these green cells here, those are target cells. And those target cells are going to respond to the hormone. They have the right receptors necessary to bind to that hormone and then cause a response. Now the yellow cells, okay, the hormones have no effect on them. They have no receptor for this hormone. Okay, maybe they have it for hormone A, but not hormone X. So if they encounter hormone X, those yellow cells in there are not going to do anything. They're not going to respond at all. But if the green target cells encounter enough of hormone X and the hormone X binds to their receptors, they'll elicit some sort of response. Okay, so the endocrine system is very precise. Okay, it's only going to target or it's only going to cause a response in those target cells that have the correct receptor. And then any of the other cells that don't have the receptor aren't going to respond. Okay, so I've talked a lot about these endocrine glands. Well, what are they? Okay, I mentioned earlier the hypothalamus in the brain. Also the pituitary, we'll talk a lot about that, and the pineal gland also in the brain. There's the thyroid, and then on the back side of the thyroid, next time we will talk about both of these, but the thyroid, behind that is the parathyroid, and that's 4 little glands on the back side or the posterior side of the thyroid. Then we have the thymus, the pancreas, remember the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. We've seen how the kidneys act as hormone secretors to help with blood pressure regulation and so forth. And then the ovaries and the testes. And so those are kind of an overview of some of the major glands. There are more, but we're not going to cover all of those in this particular class. Let's see. Hormone action, we've talked about this already. Hormones are secreted into the interstitial or extracellular spaces and then go around the bloodstream, in the bloodstream throughout the body. Now on page 493, you'll find table 13.2, and that is a list of endocrine glands. Okay, the hypothalamus, you can see the anterior pituitary thyroid and so forth. And then next to that are hormone names and hormone abbreviations. And I'm not going to make you memorize all of these hormones and where they're from and what their abbreviation is and so forth. Okay, we will talk about some special hormones. And as we go through those, I'll point out which ones I want you to know more information about and where they come from and all of that. But for example, prolactin release inhibiting hormone, PIH, not going to really talk about that one a whole lot. But this is a good table that kind of summarizes, if you ever need to for an assignment or case study coming up, know where a particular hormone comes from, you can come back to this one. Okay. So hormones, these chemical messages, let's talk about that. Chemical messages that help the body communicate. These are organic compounds. Remember, organic in science means carbon and hydrogen based. These are carbon hydrogen based chemicals, and they fall into two categories. Okay, steroid or steroid-like hormones, and then the non-steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are hydrophobic. And so that means that they do not like water. Okay, and we'll see why that's important here in just a little bit. But steroids are lipids, so you know fats and waters, oil and water, fat and water, lipids and water, they don't mix. Okay, so we'll see in just a second. Steroids are made up of 4 ring structures. And all steroid hormones start as cholesterol. Cholesterol is a precursor to testosterone, estrogen. Those are going to be produced in the testes and the ovaries. And then in the adrenal glands that sit above the kidneys, there are hormones like cortisol and aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone affects blood pressure, and cortisol is a stress hormone. If you're stressed out right now, you have cortisol pumping through your body. Anytime you're under a lot of stress, cortisol is one that's released. Okay, so all of those hormones and all of the other steroid and steroid-like hormones come from cholesterol. Okay, now the non-steroid hormones, they are different chemically. Okay, and so they're going to react and cause reactions in the cell a little bit differently, and we'll get to that. But there's 4 types of non-steroid hormones. First is the amines, proteins, peptides, and glycoproteins. Okay, the amines are going to be derived or come from, be built from the amino acid tyrosine. Okay, remember, amino acids are building blocks of proteins. You put a bunch of amino acids together, that makes a protein. Well, one particular amino acid called tyrosine is used to form the basis of epinephrine or adrenaline. Those are the same, it's the same hormone, different names, synonymous, and norepinephrine. Then some proteins, some long proteins are used to make up growth hormone or protein hormones. Oxytocin is another hormone that comes from a short chain of amino acids. So it's not a full protein, but it's a smaller chain of a bunch of amino acids put together. And then glycoproteins are carbohydrates and proteins put together, like thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH. Okay, that summarizes what we just talked about. So cortisol, I mentioned, was a steroid hormone. Okay, here's its 1, 2, 3, 4 ring structure. Here's norepinephrine. This is going to be the amine structure. Do you see all these? These are all amino acids here. This is going to be a protein hormone, parathyroid hormone. Oxytocin, again, here's a bunch of little amino acids put together. It's short though, so it's a peptide hormone, and then this one is a glycoprotein hormone. Okay, so in biochemistry or in science, if you change the shape of a particular chemical or molecule, you're going to change its function. And so each of these have different shapes, so they're going to have different functions throughout the body. And the way that these hormones communicate or cause responses throughout the body is by changing, altering metabolic processes, metabolic reactions in the body, in cells in the body. Okay, so to change the metabolic reaction or change these chemical reactions that are going on in the body, hormones might alter the enzyme activity. Remember, enzymes speed up or slow down or speed up chemical reactions. Okay, so if you speed up enzyme activity, you'll speed up the reaction. If you slow down the enzyme, you could slow down that reaction. So speeds up or slows down these reactions. Okay. Another way that hormones can change what's going on in the cell is alter the rate, how fast or how slow things are going to be exported or imported into a cell, into or out of the cell. Okay, so cells produce products and they ship those products to other places that need it. Okay, so is export sped up or is it slowed down? Is import, have they brought the substances in really good or not? Okay, now the body doesn't want to have just these huge changes in response, right? We want to maintain homeostasis. We want to have some sort of a balance, okay? We want to have a level, response, okay? So we don't want to just have big response, low response. Oh yeah, big response and then low. And we don't want those ups and downs. We want more of a kind of a level response. And so one way that the body can try to level that response off is through up and down regulation. And so the body can change the number of receptors on specific types of target cells. So for example, I'm going to come back in just a second, but here's an example target cell. Here's the bloodstream. We have this hormone floating down the bloodstream. It leaves the bloodstream. It's a steroid hormone, so it can pass right through the cell into this receptor cell, okay? Or this receptor molecule. This is the target cell and a place where this molecule can bind to, okay? In another example, here's another receptor on the outside of that cell that can bind to. Here's another one here. Now, this particular cell can add more receptors. That looks terrible. Maybe that's better. Or they can take them off. Okay, that's that up and down regulation thing. So an up regulation is an increase in numbers of receptors to respond to a decreased hormone level. So if for whatever reason hormone production fell, okay, but the body still needs to maintain its response, those cells can add more receptors to make sure they're really grabbing onto the little hormone that's available. On the other side, if there's too much of the hormone floating around, maybe one of the other glands is malfunctioning, okay, and the response is just really, really way far off, it's going too much, to decrease that response, even though there's a lot of hormones, those receptors on those cells can decrease in number, okay? So if there's way too much of a hormone, you can decrease the receptors and kind of maintain that response. Okay, so like I mentioned, steroid hormones are hydrophobic. They don't have, they're not very soluble, or they don't really dissolve in water, right? You pour oil and water together and they don't mix, okay? Same thing with steroid and thyroid hormones, okay? Thyroid hormones are amino acid based hormones, okay? And then steroid hormones, again, is going to be like testosterone, estrogen, cortisol, okay? So these are hormones that we're kind of using in this example. So since these hormones aren't very water soluble, that helps them out because they can diffuse right through the cell membrane of the target cell. Okay. And then they're going to bind to receptors inside of the cell, usually kind of the nucleus. Now, this table here spells out, and if you like to read through things and you learn well through that, you can read through the steps, but I'm going to kind of show you this visually and talk about how these steroid and thyroid hormones enter the cell, enter the target cell. Okay, so again, they've traveled through the bloodstream. Here's the hormone. Say this is cortisol. It can pass directly through this phospholipid bilayer because it's hydrophobic. Can go right straight through here. That cell will let it in, and then it will go into that cell. And this is on page 495 if you want to look at a larger view of that while I'm talking about it, or study this a little bit later. It's going to bind to this target molecule, this receptor. And then this receptor is going to activate what we call gene expression or transcription translation for those that have had maybe micro or some general biology. But basically what happens is once this receptor is activated, the cell produces a protein or many proteins that leads to a cellular response. Okay, so with this one, protein is made after the hormone binds. Okay, so this cell here is just hanging out, waiting. Cortisol comes in, binds to the receptor. That receptor then activates the transcription translation process. And this new protein is made, which is going to cause the cell to respond. Maybe it's going to, this protein is an enzyme that helps speed up a reaction. Maybe it slows down a reaction, or whatever that response is going to be. Okay, so things with steroid hormones or thyroid hormones, they can straight through go through the cell, bind to the receptor, and a protein is made that changes the cell's response. Okay, non-steroid hormones, so the other types of hormones, are not hydrophobic, so they cannot just go right through the cell membrane. They have to bind to a receptor that's on the cell membrane. So this guy, let me erase all this here. This guy here, it's on the membrane. So the hormone never enters the cell. It's not able to chemically. It's stuck on the outside, but it can bind to this receptor here. Okay. Now, this hormone, once it binds to that receptor, sets off a chain of chemical reactions. Okay. So the hormone is considered the first messenger. And it's going to bind to that receptor, and then it's going to basically set off some chemical reactions. And a second messenger, like CAMP, which is cyclic adenosine monophosphate, a cousin to ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that's going to be the second messenger. Okay. Again, if you want to read through the steps of how this happens, that is here, but I'm going to show you on this slide, and it's on page 497 if you want to look in your book. But the hormone here binds to that receptor on the outside of the cell. Then some chemical reactions take place that basically activates CAMP. Okay, CAMP is dormant. It's not doing anything. It's just hanging out, waiting for a message. So first person comes here, like they're knocking on the door. Okay, when this person here knocks on the door, they get up from the television and they walk over and, I don't know, say somebody's there to pick up a loaf of bread. They walk over, they pick up the loaf of bread, and that's the change. Okay. Now, so first messenger comes over here, knocks on the door, binds to the receptor. Receptor makes the noise, okay, stimulates CAMP, which is the second messenger, and that's going to activate some enzymes that activate dormant or already made proteins. Okay, with the steroid hormones, the proteins are made once the hormone makes contact. Here, the hormone makes contact and the second messenger basically wakes up the protein and says, okay, it's time for you to go to work now. Your ride's here. Okay. So the protein's already made, it just has to be activated. So that's what this type of hormone would do. Okay, now on page 496, I know several of you guys are athletes. Here's some information about abusing hormones or taking them supplementally to improve your athletic, or not yours, you shouldn't do this, to improve athletic performance. So if you're into that and enjoy learning more about that, you can read through there. It talks about blood doping and increasing the number of red blood cells that you would have over normal, changes in growth hormone and steroidal hormones as well. I did mention prostaglandins earlier. Those are paracrine secretions, right? They're not true hormones. They're like hormones, but they're not true hormones. Prostaglandins are not stored in cells. They're made just before they're released, and then they're really quickly inactivated by the liver and other cells. Remember, they are going to affect nearby cells. Let's see. They have a wide variety of effects. Inflammation is one of them. Okay, in micro, we just talked about inflammation and fever and so forth. Well, prostaglandins promote inflammation in the cells near them. They help with water and kidney secretion and water and sodium secretion in the kidneys, relaxing and contracting smooth muscles that would cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation, the expanding or contracting of the blood vessels. So those are some of the things that prostaglandins do. Okay, so we talked about up and down regulation to kind of keep responses at a normal level if there's way too much or way too little hormone. And those are situations that should be controlled or could be controlled through negative feedback. Okay, up and down regulation would be if negative feedback is not working, or if a person is supplementally taking too much of a hormone or too much of a chemical or drug that's altering their physiology. Okay, so negative feedback is a process in which hormone production can be toned down. I'm going to give an illustration of that here in just a little bit, but hormone secretions need to be precisely regulated. We don't want just a ton of estrogen dumping into a system, okay? We don't want just a ton of cortisol dumping out, or we don't want to get too little insulin, okay? Again, we don't want these big peaks and valleys. We want very little change, okay? So one way that we can help with that is when hormones are done, when their effects aren't needed anymore, they can be excreted in the urine, or they can be broken down in the liver and other places to get to be eliminated from the body, okay? So in a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about negative feedback, but first about positive feedback. There's very little instances in the body where we see positive feedback, but one of those is with a hormone called oxytocin and labor. Okay, when we get to the reproductive unit, we'll talk more about when a woman goes into labor and hormones involved in that and so forth. But positive feedback is basically oxytocin is released, the cervix stretches and dilates and causes contractions. The more the cervix stretches and dilates and the more contractions there are, the more oxytocin is released. So the more of the response causes more of the hormone release, and kind of on that type of a cycle. Most things in the body are controlled through negative feedback. You get a big response, okay, now we can back off with the hormone release, okay? Now, there's 3 steps or 3 ways that hormones can respond to negative feedback, okay? And I'm going to talk about some of these steps here just really quickly. Now, in our bodies, we have what are called tropic hormones. And these are hormones that go from one gland to another. And I really like this. Where did it go? This picture. You don't have to turn there yet. But here is the hypothalamus, okay? That endocrine gland in the brain. It is a very important control center in the body. Say somatostatin. Somatostatin is a tropic hormone. It's going to be released and tell the anterior pituitary to then release growth hormone, which is then going to have an effect on, say, adipose or fat tissue. Okay, so here the tropic hormone goes from this gland to this gland, and then this gland is going to actually secrete the hormone that affects the adipose tissue. Okay, that's what a tropic hormone does. Come way back. It is secreted from one gland and acts on another gland to regulate the other gland's hormone production. Okay, now the nervous system can control or stimulate glands to secrete their hormones through nerve impulses. And another way hormone secretion is regulated is through changes in the environment, changes in ions, glucose levels, or things like that. Okay, so here's what this would look like. Okay, these are going to be basically stop mechanisms. Okay, or maybe not necessarily stop, but slow down the production of a hormone. Okay, so let's take a look at the tropic hormone first. Okay, so our end result for each of these is going to be an action. Okay, a target cell producing an action. Okay, so we're going to start out by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus detects that this cell down here needs to do something to maintain homeostasis in the body. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to send a message, send a hormone to the anterior pituitary and say, hey, you need to tell the ovary, for example, it needs to ovulate now. Okay, so the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to tell the ovary to start ovulation. Okay, so then there's going to be another, actually a bunch of another set of hormones that are then released to that target cell, and then the cells in the ovary cause ovulation to occur. Okay, so hypothalamus is, you know, checking out everything, monitoring everything in the brain, and then it says, okay, down the chain of command, anterior pituitary, you need to tell this particular target area to do that. They do, and then there's an action. Okay, so we don't want ovulation to occur continuously. So there's a couple ways that that can be turned off through that negative feedback control. So let's see. So this peripheral endocrine gland, like the ovary can send a signal to either the anterior pituitary and say, hey, I did my job. Okay, quit telling me what to do. Or, and the ovary will tell also the hypothalamus, okay, yep, I got it. We've ovulated. Quit sending the message. Okay, it's not quite that straightforward, but you kind of get the gist. Like the action happened, all right, everybody back off. Okay, now with the nervous system, when the action happens, whoops, go back. Going to go back to the nervous system and cause it to stop. Changes in the environment. Okay, if you have too many hydrogen ions, okay, acidic conditions. Once you have, say, bicarbonate released, or maybe the lungs start to breathe a little bit faster and to get rid of that excess carbon dioxide, gets rid of the excess hydrogen ions, that's going to change the level of hydrogen ions, the substance in the blood, and so we can stop sending that message to tell the body to breathe faster. Okay. I like to think of negative feedback control as like with a thermostat and a furnace. Okay, so say you set your thermostat at 72 degrees. Okay, it's really cold today. I'm recording this on Thursday and it's overcast and cold and windy. And so say your thermostat is set at 72 degrees and it's really cold outside and your furnace is turned on, okay, and it gets to be 68 degrees in your house, okay? Thermostat is set at 72. So we want 72, that's kind of our homeostasis, if you will. Temperature drops down to 68. What's the thermostat do? It tells the heater to kick on. The heater is going to heat and heat and heat and heat and heat. And do we want the heater just to run indefinitely? No, because otherwise, if it does that, we're going to have a high heating bill, okay? And we're going to get like 95 degrees in our house, and that's not going to be comfortable. It's a waste of resources, a waste of energy, you know, and we're not comfortable. So the furnace is going to run and run and run until, say, maybe 73, 72, 73, and it's going to turn off. So what has happened is the heat in the room told the thermostat, okay, the thermostat detected that, and the thermostat then told the furnace, turn off, we're good. Okay, so we got so much heat it turned off. Then the thermostat or the room sits there for a while, the furnace is turned off, and it's still really cold out and the temperature starts to drop back to 68 again. Thermostat's going to detect that change in the environmental temperature. It's going to kick on the furnace and it's going to run and run and run again until it gets to that set point. Okay, same, very similar thing happening with the endocrine system or any type of negative feedback system in the body. So here, let's take a look at this. So say hormone levels have dropped, or you could say perhaps that a mechanism or a process needs to occur, okay? So receptors are going to basically identify that and tell the endocrine system, the endocrine gland, to, release hormones. Okay, hormones are going to be released. There's going to be a response. And as that response occurs more and more, we get back up to the normal hormone levels or normal process levels. Same thing here. If we have too many hormones, that's going to be detected. The signal's going to be turned off and we'll go back towards normal. Okay, so that's negative feedback. So in the body, we're never going to get this straight line of hormone concentration. Okay, there's always some ups and downs because of negative feedback. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that, but we don't want these huge swings. Okay, that's what I was talking about earlier with those huge ups and downs with up and down regulation and things like that. We don't want that. We want small changes that help us keep our average hormone concentration. Okay, we want small fluctuations. Okay. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about just a couple of these endocrine glands today, and then we'll cover the rest tomorrow. The first gland that we'll talk about is the pituitary. The pituitary is in the base of the brain, and it is going to be attached to physically the hypothalamus by what's called the pituitary stalk, or the infundibulum is another name for pituitary stalk. And it has a frontal lobe, an anterior lobe, and a back lobe, or a posterior lobe. And this is not my favorite diagram, but it's the one we have in our book here. Here is going to be where the hypothalamus sits. Remember, that's kind of the regulatory center of the brain for a lot of processes. And then there's going to be what's called the infundibulum here that connects the anterior and posterior pituitary to that hypothalamus. So there's two lobes. There's a front lobe. Okay, this is going to be, if we look at this box here, down here, okay, here's the person's eye and a nostril. This would be the anterior lobe, the front of the head, and this would be the back of the head, over here by the brainstem. The anterior lobe is going to be stimulated by the hypothalamus hormones. Okay, so if we look down here at this diagram here, up here's our hypothalamus. Okay, when the hypothalamus wants to tell the anterior pituitary to tell another endocrine gland what to do to release hormones, it's going to send its tropic hormones through this bloodstream here. That's called the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, so hormones like GnRH, gonadotrophin releasing hormone, is going to go from the hypothalamus through this blood vessel, these blood vessels here, down into the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary then is going to release growth hormone. Growth hormone. Okay, so that's an example of how that communication would work. So the anterior lobe is going to use a portal system or blood vessels to transmit a hormone. Now the posterior, and I want you to know the difference between these, the posterior lobe, which is back here, gets its information from the hypothalamus a little bit differently. It gets its information from nerve impulses, not hormones, that travel down through the infundibulum through the nervous system. Okay, so oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone, those are going to be released from the posterior pituitary, and the hypothalamus is going to tell the posterior pituitary to release one of those or both of those hormones through nerve impulses, not through hormones. Okay, so that's a difference there, and I'd like you to understand that difference. Okay, so this is basically kind of what I just went over. So the hypothalamus is going to control secretions of the pituitary and the peripheral gland, like say the ovary or the kidney or whatever. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to send a releasing hormone like GnRH, for example. And that's going to tell the pituitary to release growth hormone. And then growth hormone can travel to, let me see here. Oops, hold on one second. Sorry, just got lost here a second. Can travel to another gland, and then that gland will produce another hormone that reaches the target cell. Okay, and then this hormone here, or the action of this target cell, will slow down these releases of hormones. Okay, and also that the hormone produced by the anterior pituitary can also tell the hypothalamus, hey, slow down, back off. Again, and these are negative feedback controls. Okay, so looking just a little bit more specifically at the anterior pituitary, made up of glandular epithelial tissue. You'll see that's a little bit different than the posterior. And the anterior pituitary produces hormones in one of 5 different types of secretory cells. So for example, let's see, corticotropes are going to be cells, a type of secretory cells that are going to secrete hormones that, or actually this hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, prolactin, that is used in milk production in females. Mammotropes, secretory cells that produce this type of hormone. Okay, gonadotropes, would secrete FSH and LH, luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone. Somatotropes would secrete growth hormone. Okay, so there are different types of cells in that anterior pituitary, and whatever type of, so these are different target cells that hypothalamus hormones target. So if the hypothalamus hormone is targeting the corticotrope, it's going to release this hormone, and that hormone's then going to travel to the adrenal gland and cause cortisol to be produced. Okay, so we've looked at this a little bit earlier. So we're talking specifically about the anterior pituitary. Okay, so let's just use corticotropin releasing hormone. CRH is released from the hypothalamus. It's going to affect corticotropic. I could spell it. corticotrophic cells in the anterior pituitary. Those cells are going to release ACTH, and they're going to then go and cause a reaction in the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland will then, release cortisol, which is another hormone, which will then have its own target cells. Okay, now here we talked a little bit earlier about GHRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. It will go and affect somatotropes in the anterior pituitary. Okay, but say we have enough gonadotropin, say we have enough response from growth hormone. Somatostatin is a way that turns off the release of growth hormone. Okay, so the hypothalamus is saying, okay, we got too much growth hormone, let's stop. It'll send the message through somatostatin, and that's what turns off the production of growth hormone in that anterior pituitary. Okay, so here are some of those hormones. Okay, examples of these hormones. Growth hormone, okay, it's going to be, these are all produced by the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone is going to stimulate cells to grow rapidly. So as infants are growing, okay, that's going to increase that. Prolactin is going to stimulate milk production. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to tell the thyroid to produce T3 and T4. Adrenocorticotropic hormones, going to release cortisol. Follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, is going to tell ovarian follicles, or the eggs or sperm in men, to mature or be produced. And then luteinizing hormone is a hormone that's involved with ovulation. This is ACTH, TSH. Prolactin is PRL and GH. Okay. So those are some of the hormones involved with the anterior pituitary, or that are released from the anterior pituitary. Okay. I think we've talked about negative feedback well enough. But this is just another way to illustrate what I've been talking about. The hypothalamus sends TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone through the blood, goes to the thyroid. The thyroid's going to release T3 and or T4 in response. These are going to travel through the blood as well into these target cells. Those cells are going to do their thing. And then thyroid hormones, T3 or T4, will then tell the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, okay, we're doing our job. We don't need to overstimulate. Okay. I'm going to skip that one and talk about the posterior pituitary. Okay, so remember there's a difference between the posterior and the anterior. Posterior is connected through the nervous system with the hypothalamus. And let's see, there are two hormones, not neurotransmitters, but two hormones that are going to be produced by the posterior pituitary. And those are ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which we've learned about, and also oxytocin. Okay. Let's see. We know what ADH does, right? It helps conserve water in the kidneys. Oxytocin, as I mentioned, helps with stimulating labor and childbirth, and then also helps with milk production during breastfeeding. Okay, so here is an overview of the hormones from the pituitary. Looks at anterior and posterior. So there's a table for you guys to review there. Okay, so I'm going to stop before we get to the thyroid gland, and we'll come back and pick up here on Wednesday. Check out the daily checklist. There will be a chapter 13A homework in Connect due on Thursday. There is no lab yet. I'm going to wait until next time. Have you guys do 13B homework next time. for next or after next time. And then also I'm going to have you do a case study and maybe a lab assignment. We'll see. But we're going to stop here for now, and we'll catch up with you again on Wednesday. If you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to me, and we will talk to you later.